I'm joined now by the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrat from California. Congressman Schiff, good morning, and thank you for being back on the show.
You bet. Good to be with you.
I understand your committee has been briefed, Congressman. By whom, and what can you share with us from that briefing?
Well, we're getting information from the FBI and intelligence community. There's not much more I can share with you at this point than what you heard from the president. But look, this is a known actor operating out of Russia. And, you know, from my own perspective, Russia has the ability to shut people like this down if they choose to. So I think they have responsibility here, even if they're not engaged in the conduct themselves. And you can often tell where actors are based when you look at who their victims are. And when countries are excluded from the list of victims, like Russia often is, it's a pretty good indication of where they're operating out of. And the fact that they know if they were to cross the host government, they could be shut down. So there's some responsibility here. But obviously, we're going to be scouring the intelligence to determine what degree of culpability the Russian government may have if it goes anything beyond just the tolerance of these actors operating from their soil.
If it is that, or if it goes beyond that, Congressman, do you believe that there should be some sort of punishment for Russia?
Well, I think ultimately we're going to have to hold nations accountable for what cyber criminals do on their soil, particularly if they have the ability and the capacity to shut them down and don't. Now, I think from country to country, there is a different relationship between some of these nation states and the criminal gangs. The relation, I think, in North Korea is probably a much closer one than it may be in some other countries. And so I think we're going to have to look at the degree of culpability. We're going to have to work with our allies to figure out what's the response collectively, because these victims, these attacks are going on around the world. But here at home, we're going to have to do a much better job protecting ourselves. And years ago, I worked on legislation to try to require companies that provide critical infrastructure like this one to increase their safety standards. But we couldn't get bipartisan agreement for that.
I want to talk about the domestic piece of this. But before we do, I just to put a fine point on this, in your view, in your assessment, is there any way that Russia, that this attack could have happened without Russia having given a green light, basically, without a governmental green light from the Kremlin on this?
I'm going to wait to learn more about this particular attack and this particular group. But I think that it's clear in many countries, including Russia, the cyber criminals act with the indulgence of the government. And sometimes there's an even closer relationship where the government is working hand in hand with cyber criminals. I think at times that's true in China. I think at times that's true in Russia and North Korea and perhaps elsewhere. So I'm going to reserve judgment on this particular attack, but we do need to hold these nations accountable.
On the domestic piece of it, what we do here at home, you know that experts for a long time have been warning of something like a cyber Pearl Harbor, if you will. You've got Bloomberg calling the U.S. easy prey for ignoring one warning after another. Is this anything other than a massive failure by the U.S. government, including Congress?
Well, I think it's a collective failure of the government and the private sector. The private sector has understood its vulnerability for a long time. It resisted having the government regulate and insist on higher standards. And as I mentioned, we were not able to get that legislation passed years ago that might have helped prevent attacks like this. So it's a collective failure. And I worry, frankly, about even more critical infrastructure. You can imagine, speaking of Bloomberg, if there was an attack on our financial system and ransomware criminals were able to make it possible to determine whether people had their savings in their savings account or their checking account, what kind of mayhem there could be. So there's all kinds of different critical infrastructure. And we're really going to need to up our game. This has been going on, Hallie, for years.
Yeah.
Years ago, I had a hospital in my district tell me their data was ransomware, and the FBI told them, if you want to see it again, you better pay them.
Okay, so on that front, if this happens, right, and it's potentially one way to move forward, you had Republican Senator Marco Rubio just this morning saying companies should be required to report if they are hit with this kind of a ransomware attack, right, or any kind of ransomware attack. Do you agree? Is that perhaps a starting point or a step forward that Congress should take, among others?
I absolutely agree. There needs to be accountability. And if the companies can hide their lapses in security, and often those lapses are at their customers' mercy, then yes, it should be reported. What's more, I think companies need to share the liability for these problems and not foist it all off on insurers. So there's going to need to be, I think, a real reckoning here. And we're just going to have to up our defensive game because, both nation-state actors and sophisticated cyber criminals are stealing billions from the United States.
Before we run out of time, Congressman, I want to get you on a couple of other topics making news this morning. First, on the January 6th commission, because NBC News has learned this morning that there is some perhaps movement on that Speaker Pelosi has deputized Chairman Thompson over at Homeland Security to try to negotiate what's left of this bill, like, for example, the scope of it. Do you expect any House Republicans to get on board? And what is your assessment of a potential timeline to examine what happened on January 6th?
Well, I certainly hope that Republicans in the House will get on board. And I know John Katko has been working with Chairman Thompson on this. And I hope they're getting close to yes, because, the clock is ticking. We want to get this established. We want to make sure that we study what took place and that we have the right security in place in the future to try to protect the Capitol, but also other institutions of our government and the personnel that work in those institutions. So in terms of the timeline, it's got to get done, and it's been dragging on for far too long. But this ought to have bipartisan support, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that maybe we can get a bill as soon as this week.
We are more than 4 months, of course, after that insurrection, Congressman. Let me also ask you about something we're going to cover in just a moment on this show, and that is the escalating violence in the Middle East. Some of your colleagues are calling on the president to basically speak out more forcefully against Israel. So, for example, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib said this. Watch.
U.S. taxpayer dollars should not be used to commit human rights violations. That needs to be said. I have yet to hear anybody from the Biden administration declare that.
What do you think the responsibility of the administration is right now, Congressman Schiff?
Well, look, I think we need to be engaged to try to bring about a cessation of any kind of violence in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I think the Biden administration really has, I think, engaged far more than what we saw in the prior administration, where there was really a kind of a laissez-faire attitude toward the region and an unwillingness to help the parties get to yes. So it's early in the administration. I know they're engaged. They're going to need to be engaged because we have an indispensable role, I think, in trying to bring the parties together and bring about a peaceful resolution.
Congressman Adam Schiff, of course, who heads up the Intel Committee in the House of Representatives. Congressman, thank you again for being on the show and for your time on a lot of different topics this morning. We appreciate it.